is not something I've heard anyone else voice, and yet to me, it feels like something that needs to be said. Now, you don't have to watch this video. I've been upfront about what it's about, and I think people should make up their own opinions on games, and that people should think for themselves. Although, I guess that's a little bit of a spoiler. Speaking of spoilers, there will be plenty for Elden Ring, as well as several for Dark Souls and some minor references to other From Software games. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. I don't want to be a but before getting into my it seems that Elden Ring is superior to other From Software titles. In many ways, Elden Ring is like Dark Souls, but rather than taking its familiar formula and trying to polish it to perfection, Elden Ring instead seems to be about exaggerating it to grandness. This game is huge. Previous titles weren't small, but Elden Ring still manages to dwarf them, while consistently impressing with its unrivaled sense of grandeur, which is supported by the game's art style, soundtrack, enemy design, map size, architecture, weapon variety, boss quantity, and more. And ultimately, this ends up being one of the main qualities that gives Elden Ring its own identity. Dark Souls and Demon Souls had much more grounded settings, and their specific flavour of fantasy was overwhelmingly dark. But Elden Ring is more high fantasy, and its use of rich, vibrant colours alongside diverse locations with an often imposing sense of scale is, at its best, absolutely jaw-dropping, and it is often at its best. Some might argue that other games are more graphically impressive on a technical level, but to me, overall graphical fidelity means little when compared to a game's art direction, and in this aspect, Elden Ring might be the most visually impressive game I have ever played. Exploring this world feels like stepping into a painting, but unlike a painting, it also offers the player freedom to go wherever you see. From Software have always excelled at creating impressive sights, but this is the first time players aren't artificially limited by the edges of the game's levels. You can go anywhere. Your journey is fully seamless, and when you do get to one of the game's denser, more traditionally structured locations, you always have a sense of how each one fits into the world, enhancing their contextual meaning. To go alongside this freedom to explore, Elden Ring also provides the player with more tools than ever before. The star of the show is the familiar stamina-based combat system, and this is still a very combat-focused game, but within this combat the player now has more options, and no playstyle seems to have been completely overlooked. Shield users get guard counters to provide a new offensive option, dual wielding returns with its own dedicated attack animations, jumping offers new offensive and potentially defensive combat actions, Spirit Ashes offer a strong enhancement for anyone who doesn't want to tackle all the game's challenges alone, a stealth system now exists and can sometimes be useful. Enemies, including some bosses, can be stance broken, giving the player a chance to critically hit them, and providing a reward for player aggression and using heavy attacks. Ashes of War give individual weapons greater flexibility and allow for more experimentation, while providing non-magic users some flashback magic compatibility to spend FP on. Magic users themselves have more spells to play around with, and everyone has more weapons to choose from. There's also Force. There are some balance problems, of course, but this is objectively the most complex and diverse the combat in this series has been, and as this is such a long game, with so much combat in it, more options are always a positive. As for the Horse, it provides a new way to approach combat encounters in the open world that is surprisingly successful. I say surprising because the track record for pre-existing series successfully adding mounted combat is quite frankly appalling, and I don't think many would have expected Souls-like stamina-based combat to prove an exception to this, and yet From Software have pulled it off remarkably well. Torrent feels responsive, maneuvering in combat isn't overly restrictive, and overall this adds a new option for players that feels suitably balanced. Mounted combat can feel rather unpredictable, but in some ways I think this works in its favour. In effect, you trade defensive reliability for mobility, while still getting to keep your high damage. This means Torrent becomes a great option for fights where mobility is particularly important, like against dragons, or for fights where you just don't really respect the enemy's offensive capability.